Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Tim Chadbourne from the Behavioural Insights Unit of the World Health Organization in Geneva. I'm very honoured to moderate this session on getting started with behavioural science, which you should find relevant whether you're just getting started or you're looking for new inspiration. This is day 3 of 5 days of Behavioural Science Week. Behavioural Science Week includes 15 events and over 60 speakers from 46 entities. So really wide representation from across United Nations entities. Here you can see the variety of topics covered this week, from our session on getting started with behavioural science today, to building capacity, expanding behavioural science methods, bridging behavioural science and data science, and also an introduction to behavioural science and AI, among lots of other interesting sessions. I really hope you can dial into multiple sessions and take away really valuable insights that you can apply to your work. So the week is coordinated by the UN Behavioural Science Group, and that connects UN entities and supports the adoption of behavioural science. As you can see, it has over 7,000 members in over 70 UN entities in over 150 countries. So really wide reach. And the focus of the UN on behavioural science comes from its prioritization as one approach of a quintet of change. These 5 approaches were recognized as necessary to make these international organizations fit for the future as forward-thinking cultures. You can read more about behavioural science at the UN and join the UN Behavioural Science Group to keep engaged even after this week. Mary McLennan, who leads the group, will put the links in the chat for you to explore. And just in terms of housekeeping for this session, we have 1 hour together, during which we'll have about 25 minutes for discussion with panelists, and then about 20 minutes for the panelists to answer your questions. We will only address the questions that are asked in the Q&A, so please do read what other people are asking and vote for those that you'd like to be discussed. We'll aim to ask the panelists to respond to the most popular questions. So, in introduction, behavioural science, as you heard, is growing across UN entities as a priority pillar of the UN 2.0 quintet of change, and also really expanding across the world, as you might have seen as mapped by the OECD. But many people tasked with adding value to their organization through behavioral science would still welcome support so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel where others have gone before. So this session brings together diverse perspectives from different UN entities to share experiences of starting with and progressing with the use of behavioural science. The speakers will highlight some of the challenges and lessons learned across areas such as operational support, data-driven decision-making, and digital learning. So we have 4 speakers today. So Sonia Guerrero from the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. Sarah Castro de Halgren from the United Nations Economists Network, UNEN. Rebecca Kozenek from the International Trade Center, and Eileen Zeckmeister from the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So if we're going to get now into the panel discussion, I'm going to invite them to colleagues just to put their cameras on and join us in this session. And we're going to have a couple of questions that we're going to ask the panelists to respond to. The same question for all the panelists. They're going to take turns in giving their different perspectives from the different UN entities in which they work. So if you please remember just to 2 or 3 minutes, please, just for each. And the question we're going to put to you and ask you to share with the colleagues online is, how are you getting started, or how are you progressing with behavioural science in your UN entity? A very broad question, And maybe first, if I can come to Eileen, that'll be great. If you can share your perspective with us on getting started or progressing with behavioral science in your entity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Yes, as you already mentioned, I work with UNDESA and have a specific focus on capacity development and digital learning. And so I need to say too that I myself am very new to behavioral science, and incorporating behavioral science into our work, still very much at the beginning stages. So as much as maybe you all will benefit, I'm right along with you in being in the beginning. And so yes, our team was definitely looking to meet some desired goals and work with UN 2.0 and becoming more agile and looking into how behavioral science can support all of our capacity development activities. And so starting at the beginning, looking at small changes that we can implement. And so when I think about these small changes, it's really thinking about how learners learn and using things like nudge theory. So finding ways to use reminders, notifications, progress, statuses, and symbols when you're going through a training so you know how far along you are. These little things to help us keep going and stay motivated to be able to have a greater impact and change. And really exciting too is through a UN network of learning managers. We've connected on many topics, but are now also a wonderful subgroup that have a desire to work together and how we can find ways to use behavioral science specifically within our learning manager roles. And so our newly created kind of subgroup is growing again with across all kinds of UN entities in different roles. So yes, this is kind of to place where we are and where I am in our journey with behavioral science. Yeah, I guess that would be it for me, Tim. I hope, I haven't gone over with my short time. I know we've got a lot to cover and it's very exciting.
No, thank you, Eileen. That's really nice. Thank you for sharing that. I think we're going to move now on to Sarah.
Thank you, Tim. So yes, from the UN Economists Network, I think I would just share a couple slides to introduce colleagues that are joining us today to the UN Economists Network. And so from the UN Economists Network side, it was founded in 2019, and so we have this network across the UN system that was founded as part of repositioning the UN development system as a UN-wide network that really aims to foster collaboration, joint work across the UN system, and build synergies as well to advance and strengthen UN thought leadership and shape analysis for the 2030 agenda across different economists, including RCO economists in the system. So the network cuts across this global, national, and local leadership, and so and representation in the system from economists. And we have in the network more than 500 economists, actually, including some behavioral economists that are working at these different levels from 28 different entities. And in terms of how we started with behavioral science, it's been very light touch so far, but what the network has done is recognize the importance of behavioral science and behavior change. And this was in the very beginning in 2020 when the network published its first report on the occasion of the 75th UN anniversary. The report was on shaping the trends of our time around key shifts or trends that we're facing as humanity, namely climate change, demographic shifts, the emergence of digital technologies and inequality. And it noted that these are all as a result of human activity, and as such, they can be shaped by human decisions and policy choices. But the report at that time did note that change in behaviors and mindsets does not yet match the ambition for sustainability. So we have recognized this as a network, as an important topic and issue. And last year, we conducted a survey among UN economists for the HLPF, where we recognized that the key need or key call from economists in the system was for a new economic model. Since then, we have worked on topics and continue to work on different areas, including new economics for sustainable development, fiscal papers and research and activities and policy recommendations, including on industrial policy. But much more needs to be done to incorporate the possibilities that behavioral science offers to ensure the societal change at the scale that we need to confront and solve these global challenges. So we have recognized this as a network and continue with some of the ongoing projects. And I think that the network offers a key global resource in this regard for continued coordination across the system in an interdisciplinary perspective that goes hand in hand with behavioral science. And the economists also, I think, focus on some of the key areas where we see evidence from behavioral science, including taxation, demographics, climate change, and overcoming some of the key biases in those areas as well. And I think that many of the economists are eager to identify solutions and bridge the science policy society gap as well. And currently in the network, 2 work areas have emerged where we can continue to enhance the importance of development ideas like behavioral insights for these global challenges. And these cut across institutional perspectives as well. So I think that the 2 working groups that we have, for example, one on human-centered economics and one on foresight, could benefit from more on behavioral science. The group on foresight has chosen to focus on 4 key themes: jobs, digital transformation, climate, energy, and governance as overarching elements. And when applied, we know, for example, that foresight can directly tackle behavioral biases like normalcy bias and present bias. And then on the side of human-centered economics, this is just emerging, but we are pushing for a paradigm shift in how we conceive economic growth, development, and moving beyond GDP-centric approaches. And so there too, there is a lot of room to integrate behavioral science. And I think with this start of our participation here today, we really look forward to the discussion and lessons from our session today, but also from the week. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Fascinating stuff. And we will get in more into talking about that a little bit more later, but really, really interesting. I think we have Rebecca next to share a little bit about how you're getting on or started or progressing with behavioral science in your entity. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, and hello, good morning, good day, good evening maybe to everybody who has joined. So my name is Rebecca Pejković-Kožinec. I work for the strategy department in the International Trade Center in Geneva. So for those who may not know ITC yet, it is an agency with 2 parents. It's a technical arm of the UN Trade and the World Trade Organization. So we are a very projectized organization, and most of our work is delivering trade intelligence and trade-related technical projects or technical assistance with a focus on MSMEs or micro, small and medium enterprises. So therefore, one of our areas of interest in applying the behavioral science is in project life cycles. So to monitor, to plan for the change, to monitor the change through the results chains or theories of change. And those would be ideally designed to engage with the right influencers that could catalyze the changes. So in that sense, what we want to do is explore ways to achieve multiplier effects. Behavioral science talks about nudges, ripples, champions, and for example, we are using already the local institutions as hubs in areas that we work. For example, the digital hubs, green hubs, she trades hubs, this in work with women, digital entrepreneurs, youth. We have a year community, for example. So they're connected to that. There are a few challenges that we have encountered, and we would like to explore ways to overcome those through maybe like measurement of broader adoption of change or changes in behavior on a large scale. This is why we are interested in kind of showing how much more value for money we are actually adding for each dollar spent. So a challenge that we have is, let's say that when measuring a broader or systemic change, institutions tend to apply different methodologies, different multipliers, a bit liberally sometimes. So we would appreciate views on how to unify or these approaches or a system-wide guidance on certain elements. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Now, unfortunately, Sonia couldn't be with us today, but she has sent us a recording. So she has answered the question. So Mary and Timon, if you could put the recording up for people to share, that would be great. Here's Sonia. Just don't have any sound at the moment.
A behavioral science approach in their design.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this session. My name is Sonia Guerriero, and I work in the education sector at UNESCO. At UNESCO, we don't yet have a formal behavioral science program, although many projects might be using a behavioral science approach in their design. So for example, as part of an intervention, there might be an initial review phase that is investigating needs or barriers or challenges and facilitators. But how this information is then used to design the intervention might not be clearly used. Where I think we can use behavioral sciences at UNESCO to make changes is in the use of data and evidence for decision making, which is one of our priority areas for supporting member states. This is a struggle for many countries, and I'm sure it's not exclusive to the education sector. While education systems around the world have made good progress in collecting education-related data, there are still barriers to how to use this data. We can also use behavioral sciences, I think, to improve the use of scientific information about how students learn, which could go a long way to improve education policies and practices. But this has been challenging because it's not immediately obvious how this type of evidence can be applied to teaching and learning. And this is a huge science policy gap in the education sector. But we think that a behavioral science approach can improve the uptake of data and scientific evidence for decision-making in education. And we think that one of the first things we need to do is to sensitize colleagues about this. So to get started, what we decided to do was to begin with a landscape review of how the behavioral sciences have informed the work of other international organizations, such as UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and the World Bank. A very preliminary scan is showing that behavioral sciences have been used within education projects, but used primarily for health interventions. Still, this shows potential that we can, in fact, use behavioral sciences in education projects, in particular around getting teachers to change their teaching practices, which is a major challenge. So, for example, teachers might still be using some outdated teaching practices, such as asking kids to memorize content, which would appear in an exam. And we know that kids learn better if they're using more active learning strategies where they can deal with the material in a hands-on way. And this is also grounded in scientific evidence about how children learn best. But many teachers still believe that teaching is an art, and so it's difficult to study it. So we need to work on changing their mindset so they can change their practices. So the idea would be to use this landscape review to share with our leadership to raise awareness about the behavioral sciences and what the behavioral sciences can do to improve our educational interventions.
So that was a great perspective also for UNESCO. And if I just summarize a few of the points that sort of stood out to me in those initial presentations or initial perspectives, I think some really interesting aspects. Eileen talked about some small changes, starting small. You might have heard of this in different, like chunking. You might have heard of this in graded tasks. There are different terminologies that are used to kind of describe this, but taking small steps and demonstrating the value can be a really valuable approach, behavioral science approach even. Also heard both from Eileen and Sarah about collaboration and networks, that sort of shared interests coming together to use new ways of working and use behavioral science, potentially in communities of practice where people have intrinsic motivation. They have their own motivation to do this. They're not being encouraged or forced to do this, but they're coming together because they think that using behavioral science can help their own aims within their own area of work. I think it's very interesting hearing from Sarah about the new economic model. And it made me think a lot about how we think in behavioral science about using behavioral science, behavioral insights as a lens. So it's a slightly different perspective with which we look on things from a behavioral perspective, but also bringing in those frameworks, the evidence to apply to a problem from maybe what might be a different area of literature from the behavioral science literature, which hasn't really been applied if your work is based in another sort of particular area of literature. We also heard, I think also Rebecca was talking about project life cycles and theories of change, and I think that's really interesting. I've thought a lot about how theories of change often would benefit from a theory. So using a behavioral theory to underpin our thinking of of change and how change happens, to really underpin a theory of change and all of the work on evaluation that follows with a theory that explains how people's behavior is influenced and how it's changed. And then Sonia, really they're highlighting how behavioral science, in my mind, can be used in sort of two levels, maybe. One is also thinking about the audience that we're, and our end users of our programs, whether they are teachers and pupils or different areas of policy, but also thinking about using behavioral science to improve the uptake of data and evidence for decision making. So we can apply behavioral science to the work that we do and think in a behaviorally informed way about how we approach and how we build behavioral science capacity within our organizations. Great, so that's the first bit. We're just going to move on to another question. And again, I'm going to ask if colleagues can kind of be quite mindful of the time. We're doing quite well. But we're going to move on to thinking about some of the successes and or challenges and lessons learned, or the opportunities. So we're going to ask our colleagues to think about what was difficult, what advice they might give to other colleagues who are starting out in this area. So Eileen, I'm going to come back to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tim. Happy to get us started on this next part. Goodness. Let me see. Now, of course, trying to share my screen again. So definitely one thing that has felt very motivating because it's going quite well is our growing subnetwork within the UN Learning Managers Group. It was fantastic to see all these colleagues in different parts of their behavioral science journeys enthusiastic about working together and collaborating, exchanging resources. That's been really exciting. And then even internally, finding out within DESA what other colleagues are doing, and the progress that they're making and the resources that they have. And then also finding out about all of the resources that exist within the behavioral science network. And very excited that Mary and her team have provided all of this. And it's just kind of, we're really at the beginning. And so when I think about the challenge and challenges that we're facing or continuing to face, is it can, as exciting as it is, it can also feel a little bit overwhelming, specifically in wanting to implement a behavioral science approach, and knowing the benefits that can come with designing learning, for example, in my case, designing e-learning that is both efficient and engaging. And so I think it's really important that we stop ourselves from becoming overwhelmed, and knowing that there are the resources out there. And so using these networks that are in place to collaborate. And I think Tim already kind of stole my advice, but my advice would definitely be, pick one thing or identify something small that you can do, and start doing it. Yeah. Can take my own advice as well, but I think that's where I would be. And yeah, to be mindful of the time, Tim. I think that'll be it for me.
Thank you, Eileen, and hopefully I didn't steal what you said, but just emphasized
There you go.
one of your points there. So, but a really valuable one. Thank you so much. Sarah, maybe you could take the same question and share your thoughts.
Yes, well, I think in terms of UN Economist Network, we had this basis established in the previous publications, and peppered throughout, I'd say, other publications on recognizing the urgency of addressing behavior change mindsets, and that it wasn't happening at the scale that's necessary. And also the need to address social norms. I think this has been mentioned, but I think the key challenge, or the key need and opportunity as well, is in prioritizing which behaviors specifically, or which biases or barriers we need to change, and what priority policy topics, because we work in that domain of science, policy, society as well. And specifically, how can UN economists be engaged in facilitating the collaboration or the upscaling of the evidence base that is there, maybe at country level, that some may be working on, but perhaps not others, to ensure this joint work and the system-wide approach, and bringing it back to the view and the focus of the network, which is, I think, all of our focus eventually, is advancing the 2030 agenda and newer agendas as well, such as the Pact for the Future. How can we tie that in? This week in Behavioral Science this week, I've seen some of those links as well, including to other parts under the Pact for the Future. So in our sense, I think our priority could be in this field and in this link is to set the strategy. And one lesson learned in that sense is answering that call to that was made for a new economic model. And then how can behavioral science advance that in one of our next meetings, for example. And another opportunity, I think, is working with UNIN for global dialogue or regional dialogues on behavioral science and insights, linking it to those policy domains, perhaps priority policy domains, and then looking at how behavioral insights could focus on perhaps context-specific solutions that we need to engage in for wider systemic change, when we talk about systemic change, right? And how can that add value in terms of our own work within the system, but then also the policy agendas that we're seeking to advance in specific countries or regions. Yes. So I think I would throw it over to you, Tim, in terms of how could we answer and advance some of those questions, and to the colleagues as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. So now we'll hear the perspective of Rebecca again, thinking about what are your challenges, maybe what some of your lessons learned from the work you've done so far. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Tim. And just a disclaimer, no slides from me, because we received the question. I think there was a bit of maybe confusion. Voila, so three things. What was useful, lesson learned, and a challenge for us. Again, I'm talking primarily about project planning, monitoring, implementation angle in terms of the trade-related technical assistance projects. So we are in early stages, conscious considerations of the behavioral science as such have started very recently. We have found very, very useful the body of knowledge that has been already produced by the behavioral science community of the United Nations. For example, the guidance and the reporting, there is a report on behavioral science from the other UN organizations. It was very useful for us because we were able to benchmark ourselves against the things and the examples that have shown as valuable for other organizations. So we are a very small organization in the UN sense, and we are grateful, very grateful to this community that we don't have to start from scratch. So the lessons learned was obviously when we have reviewed the existing approaches, we thought, okay, we might be applying behavioral science intuitively in some cases in terms of how we nudge the markets, how we produce the global public goods so that we raise awareness, especially, for example, in such unpredictable market environment as it is now. It is very, very crucial to provide to the beneficiaries the timely information so that they can react and behave in the way that's good for them. So this is something that we do. Now, a challenge, lastly. So we want to become better in designing our projects, in planning for them, and in monitoring the market triggers. So what can trigger the changes in beneficiary behavior and what can trigger the optimization of the market? Let's say when we work with LNOB groups, leaving no one behind, and how do we ensure the uptake that can be scalable of a particular change? So in a typical scenario for ITC, where we work with micro producers or small and medium enterprises, we can work or we can organize work around the implementing partner in the field that will provide for the new services that initially will be financed by the project, but ultimately we want them to continue after a project. We want them to be profitable or to be useful, profitable for the organization and useful for the beneficiaries or for the members of the organization in the long term. So we want to produce incentives that will work in the long term for all the actors, both the business actors and the individuals that we work for. So ultimately, we want them to focus on measuring the right things instead of accumulating the requirements, and which could have adverse effects. Let's say we could have attrition rate of beneficiaries, and after the project is gone, the activities would naturally come to an end too. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. And now once again, we have a video from Sonia, where she should be able to give us her perspective. Great. Can we just check that the sound?
In terms of lessons to share, since we're at still the very early stages, I don't have many lessons to share. Our challenge still lies in making the leadership aware of the potential of behavioral science approaches in the first place. The case is still that an intervention is being designed without conducting a behavioral analysis to better understand the mindsets that need to be changed. As I mentioned, sometimes we may be collecting information about barriers and facilitators, but not really using this information to better understand how to change behaviors. Another challenge is the limited scope of donor funds. I think we also need to raise awareness among donors, because if the financing available, if within the financing available for a project, there's no room to integrate a behavioral science method as part of the design, then we can't even get started. So one of our struggles has been to not only raise awareness among the leadership, but also raise awareness among donors about the potential of integrating a behavioral science approach. in an intervention.
Fantastic, thank you. So we've now heard from all four speakers on those two different types of questions. Firstly, sort of what the status is and where they are in their organization. And then secondly, thinking more about the challenges and the lessons learned so far, although sort of recognizing the length of time that they've been working in this area already. So firstly, let's just maybe if I can just sum up or provide some insights that kind of I think have followed from all of those discussions. I think there's some interesting threads through some of those different points. One of the aspects I think is that even and although behavior change is context specific, organizations can apply a common framework. We heard a little bit about evidence and frameworks, etc. So we can apply these behavioral frameworks to address problems from a behavioral perspective. Once we agreed on a problem or objective, and I think Sarah just mentioned this in terms of the prioritization of policy topics, we need to be clear about what is the problem, what's the policy topic that we're going to prioritize and work on. We need to clarify that, and then we can start by really, as Sonia was just saying there, doing a sort of behavioral analysis or diagnosis to really understand the barriers and enablers to change. And we need to then link that to the design of appropriate interventions or strategies to target those barriers and enablers. And these need to be implemented, evaluated, and scaled up, because the evaluation and the proof that things work or don't work as we expect, and the lessons we learn from those processes are really important, and really need to be informed, need to be scaled up to really achieve the impact that we're hoping for. And another thing, again, Sarah just mentioned this, but around an important word I think is prioritization. So we need that at all steps, because there will be multiple policies that we can think about addressing. Each of those will have multiple behaviors that could be targeted. There will be multiple barriers and enablers and multiple possible interventions. So the behavioral science really should help us in finding the most suitable, efficient, effective interventions that really address the problems that we are challenged with. And I think also people mentioned that organizations often have a experience with prioritization, and they may be very familiar with looking at impact and feasibility to select things. But we want that to be probably behaviorally informed and human-centered. So there's also a process that we can think about involving consensus building with stakeholders, including the populations whose behavior need to change. And that can really center the work that we have on the population who we're targeting. Another thing that struck me, I think, from listening to these conversations was around the initial work of using behavioral science in an organization can really be about establishing some of those common frameworks. So there may be people existing already working to some extent in related areas. We need to have a sort of a bit of a common language and a common way of working. So choosing or developing for a behavioral framework that we can all use together, and the processes that we go through, including stakeholder engagement and prioritization, the behavioral processes that we work through can be something that brings us together and helps us kind of work towards the same aims within an organization. Another sort of moment I had there during the presentations was that organizations, as I said, will often be using behavioral science to some extent. I think a couple of people mentioned that. There are skills, capacities, capabilities often existing in the organization. But they might not be applying behavioral science in a very structured, systematic, or complete approach. So possibly not achieving the full impact that they could achieve. So I think that's where again, bring the behavioral science and bringing people together to use that in a sort of concerted way can really help. That's something I took from some of the presentations there. And then I suppose to sort of finish off, if I may make 3 suggestions, I think, based on experience, etc. And I'm just going to ask colleagues Mary or to put in the chat, maybe you can share with you all a couple of the products that we've been developing here at WHO and we've published over the last couple of years, doing work to really think about how people get started with behavioral science and what they can do, what are the sort of questions they need to ask, and how do they engage with colleagues around this process. Firstly, doing maybe some mapping of the capacity and need within the organisation, as we've been talking about, creating a bit of a baseline, identifying champions and expertise that already exist, but also thinking about demonstrating the need. Who was it? It was talking about engaging, one of the challenges of kind of engaging senior stakeholders. I think Sonia was talking about that in her video, right? In terms of if we have a lot of stakeholders internally and externally who are calling for this to be used and believe it will make a difference and make an improvement, then we have something to engage leadership with. And we have some data. I think that's key. So we've done that ourselves in WHO. We've also supported governments to do it and found it very useful. It can also help to create that community of practice if people are feeling a little bit lonely, a little bit alone with their vision of what behavioral science could do. Secondly, potentially thinking about establishing that common framework that we've just been talking about to help build a systematic, efficient, and more comprehensive approach to problem solving using behavioral science, bringing colleagues together around that with shared aims, helping to communicate as well what behavioral science is and how it's used to colleagues if you have that framework or models. Maybe thirdly, taking a behavioral approach, as we talked a little bit about before, like taking a behavioral approach to the establishment of behavioral science in an organization. For example, working with people who are, like I said, have shared aims or intrinsic motivation, rather than trying to convert doubters, people who are going to challenge. Finding quick wins or making those small changes first with resources that can demonstrate the value to stakeholders, and engaging expertise internally or sourcing externally to bring in that rigor and confidence. So it may be that we have teams or groups of people internally within the organization, but actually trying to find out where there may be external or internal expertise on these matters that we could maybe draw in. So all of that kind of really comes together to support the sort of buy-in. The buy-in is really key, as Sonia said. Whether bringing external expertise will really help build the trust and confidence, but it might also be that an external messenger, if you think about the messenger effect of behavioral science, an external messenger might communicate to your senior management more effectively than you can yourself. Aiming to demonstrate alignment with organizational priorities and addressing those priorities. But also managing expectations of the size of the impact and emphasizing the value of testing and evaluating and learning through the process. I think that can be really important when you're starting out, because it can be tempting to overpromise on some of these things. So those are some more reflections. Now we quickly move towards the Q&A. So maybe if I can invite all our colleagues to come back on put their cameras on. One of the things I've just noted is some of the questions are quite sort of have specific questions around behavioral science, and what we've just been talking about is getting started with behavioral science. So I don't really want to put some aspects of these questions to the colleagues who may not be in a position to kind of to answer them yet. But the most upvoted question was really about social media campaigns. So I just wonder whether Sarah, Eileen, or Rebecca, are any of you doing any work with social media campaigns, or have been exploring the value of social media campaigns and can share anything of getting started in that area?
Not Not from the UN Economists Network, we have not done that, but I would only, as any economist would do, point you to the evidence and note that the evidence does show that social media campaigns, messaging, the way that the messaging is framed, of course, or reframed, is central to achieving behavioral science objectives in terms of behavior change or mindset change or value change and overcoming key biases. So there is plenty of evidence in that regard. Thanks.
Rebecca, thank you. Rebecca, Eileen, do you want to add anything? Have you done any work with social media campaigns?
No, not directly, but I think Sarah did a great job of giving some tips there, and just again keeping it human-centric, right? Thinking about the folks who are going to be the receivers of the information in the campaigns.
Thank you. I would just, yes, Rebecca, please.
I can provide again a projectized example. So several of our projects have been doing the social media campaigns in terms of the policy work when they wanted to increase awareness. And I mean, these campaigns also included campaigns on other media like radio, TV, and so on. When they wanted to increase the participation or awareness about the policy changes for certain groups, let's say for the youth in the Gambia, there was one example. And also, I think that the media was used across several projects in Africa where there were competitions or calls where we have mobilized participants to apply, let's say, for funding. So it was a very, very important tool. We found it very useful, and we have even developed our own tool for dissemination of certain information where we can monitor, like where do people engage, like, so what are the hot topics, when you kind of like look in what they read and what they skipped. So voila, this is one example maybe. Thanks.
Thank you. It's really important. Yeah, behavioral science has a huge amount to contribute to communications and the effectiveness of communications and the evaluation of communications in terms of behavior change. But I think also one of the things we maybe repeat on a number of occasions is don't just be limited to your communications, but really think about the wider environmental changes and other types of interventions that can be delivered, because behavioral science is not just limited to communications. But I also would just link you back to the agenda for this week and actually remind you that I believe it's tomorrow afternoon for me, there is a session on advanced behavioral science methods. So there's a presentation within that, actually from my colleagues here at WHO, which is around social media campaigns and particularly around sort of framing, etc. So but really, if you're really interested in that, then I'd really recommend you attend that session. It should be really interesting for you. Okay, we'll move on to the next most popular question around digital platforms. So how important are digital platforms in enhancing the adoption of behavioral sciences in the work of the United Nations and beyond? Is anyone who'd like to jump in and tackle this one?
I'd like to, if possible, Tim. So specifically in my role, we use digital platforms quite extensively, and so we look at learning management systems, and I think when you look at that with behavioral science, it becomes quite obvious that you get to do the full spectrum of testing what works. You have live data about what participants are doing, what's working, what's not. You have that feedback that can be so critical, and then also being able to implement changes and test those changes. And I think when the digital world just gives us a much kind of quicker, more efficient way to do that. So very, very, very much, without saying that, digital platforms are crucial, I think they can be very effective in that regard.
That's great. Sarah, Rebecca, do you want to add anything?
No, thank you. For in this area, I remain silent.
Yes, I think exactly as Eileen, I think she fully answered the question, but they can also serve to network and connect us, I think, on the different types of evidence that we continue to find in the field, because it has been evolving. And I think the key in the last decade or so with behavioral science, what you see is that there has been a real shift in terms of the amount of studies that are produced, and also shift towards having more evidence produced in developing countries, or the countries in which we work a lot. So we, through digital platforms, we can continue to share that evidence and collaborate more on exchanging it. It's central to that, to using digital transformation to bridge that science policy society gap that I mentioned. And so I think it will just increase in importance the more we are able to produce better evidence, more tailored evidence, and it will play a central role in closing the gap in terms of addressing or connecting the evidence to scalable policy insights and interventions in countries.
Thank you, Sarah. Great insights there. One thing I just want to add, linked a little bit to what you were saying, Eileen, is one of the benefits of digital working in the digital space is that there's sort of not really any question about fidelity, by which we mean, has the intervention been delivered as you planned it to be delivered? Because on a digital platform, it is delivered, and you can test different behavioral concepts very cleanly and clearly, which don't happen in the real world. But let's just remember, so much important behaviors happen out of the digital space. So while it might be easy and convenient and a lot of impact through digital, we have to tackle some of the difficult difficult contexts as well. I'm going to move on to the next question. We've just got a few minutes left. Social and behavior change communication has been around for some time. What are the new approaches that we can use in this space? How communication works and contributes to the current behavioral science framework. So I think this is kind of really exploring some of the similarities and differences between a communication approach and a behavioral science approach. We talked a bit about social media campaigns, but maybe if you have any thoughts on what you've done so far to look at the differences and to what extent you want to use communication approaches and behavior change frameworks within those approaches. Anyone would like to kick off?
Yes, I could say something. So when I think about communication and behavioral science, specifically when looking at promoting our digital learning activities and efforts, and communicating it not only internally to colleagues, but trying to really get a broad reach when we have open resources, and finding ways to reach folks, and whether that be through traditional email, and trying to address how we compose the emails and the outreach, trying to limit text and knowing that folks can get quite overwhelmed with lots of text, and keep it visual maybe, but also looking towards other things besides traditional email. So we all are connected maybe through Teams, so maybe a message through Teams or Teams channels, reminders if we posted it maybe in a SharePoint space, that there are different ways to share that than just sending, a mass email. So I'm not sure if that's 100% applicable to the communication topic, but when I think about us trying to reach out both internally and to folks outside of the UN, this is something we're still trying to work on, because we would like to have, a broader reach, and that the communication doesn't get lost somewhere.
So Rebecca, would you want to add to that, or we have a few more minutes? We could take one more question.
I think it's very well articulated, so maybe to the next question. Thank you so much.
Great. And just to reiterate that point about communications is a fantastic sort of mode of delivery and a kind of type of way we can deliver policies and behavior change interventions. But just behavioral science can work across much more broader types of interventions and types of routes of interventions. So would be one of my comments there. Okay, great. The next one, how young behavioral economists, especially from developing countries, can collaborate to share their learnings, learn from experts, and help in advancing change in their own countries. I think this is something that you can identify with. Who would like to start with this one?
I think I can start, if that's okay. It's part of what I mentioned before, and that's, again, through the digital platforms, of course, but also linking to existing academia and maybe UN country team personnel or economists in the countries that are conducting studies, or any types like the WHO, Tim, and others that may be conducting studies at country level. And so having these, I think, communities of practice at country level, I think, is one key way. But then also there's established, if one is already an academic, for example, in the UN Economist Network, we work with UN University Network, and we have UNU Wider, for example, and they are working with young scholars. So these are different types of avenues, but also there are existing communities of practice and a lot of different studies that are being carried out or have been carried out. So I think connecting to those is really central.
Fantastic. Some really great practical things there. Rebecca, Eileen, do you want to have last words? We've got 1 minute left, so I think I can see so many interesting questions here. As always, there's so much to talk about and discuss. But I just want to say thank you very much. Thank you very much to Mary McLennan and colleagues at the UN Secretary General's office for kind of organising all of Behavioural Science Week. Thank you so much to Sarah, Rebecca, Eileen, and Sonia for coming together, preparing your presentations and your thoughts, and taking questions from our colleagues online, our attendees. And do just, get involved, get engaged. There's some really interesting sessions coming up over the next couple of days, so do look into them. And the recordings of these, the different sessions, will be posted on the UN Behavioural Science website. So do take a look at there. There's a lot of useful information, as our panelists have said, on the website. And these recordings will be up there for you to look into. So all the best. Thank you so much for your contributions, and happy Behavioural Science Week. Thank you so much.